We continue with our 7th week of online lessons. A reminder that you can access these lessons on various online platforms, and you can contact me in order to ask questions and get assistance. Today's lesson is the second last one for the text of the play. We shall focus on 2 scenes of Act 5 today, scenes 4 and 5. You should be used to the lesson format by now. The first part of the lesson will be devoted to answering the questions on Act 5, scenes 2 and 3, which you answered in the previous lesson. The rest of the time will be spent on scenes 4 and 5. Make sure that you have everything that you need for this lesson. Get comfortable and let's get started. We start with a recap of scenes 2 and 3. The answers that follow are suggestions. It's very likely that you have written other responses which are also valid. Obviously, the reference to Birnam Wood reminds us of the witch's prophecy that Macbeth will be safe until Birnam Wood moves to Dunsinane. The quote referenced in the second question makes us consider Macbeth's motivation, his character. He is either as crazy as a coot, or he's a brave but angry man. How do you view Macbeth? Do you see him as a madman? Or do you see him as a courageous and ambitious soldier, if somewhat misguided? The quotation used in question 3 is from a speech by Angus, where he comments that the murders committed by Macbeth are no longer secret. The whole of Scotland is surely aware of Macbeth's deeds. The imagery of his deeds sticking to his hands should remind us of Lady Macbeth's sleepwalking scene, when she tried in vain to get rid of the evidence, the blood, from her hands. Clothing imagery is highlighted in the fourth question. Macbeth will never be comfortable in his borrowed robes. He stole the crown, so he's a thief. And as a king, he is a poor successor to King Duncan. Macbeth is a dwarf of a man, trying to follow in the footsteps of a giant. The final question highlights the imagery of plants and growth. Macbeth is described as a weed, a plant that causes illness. Lennox says that it is their job to get rid of the weeds, to purge the country in preparation for the planting of the sovereign flower. In other words, clearing the way for the rightful king, Malcolm. At the beginning of scene 3, Macbeth desperately clings to the witch's prophecies. He fortifies his castle, Dunsinane, but underneath his bullying and nervous energy, the audience can see increasing levels of despair. Macbeth's repetition of Seaton's name points to an increasing sense of panic. And by the way, an interesting piece of information, the Seaton family have always been armor bearers to the various kings of Scotland. The reference to the yellow leaf should remind us of the passing seasons. Macbeth realizes that he is in the autumn of his life. Events are overtaking him and he must see what the likely outcome will be. Of course, yellow is a color associated with cowardice. It's possible that he knows he'll have to draw on his reserves of courage in order to meet his end. Macbeth's anxiety is evident when he demands that his armor be brought to him. He orders that anyone who talks of fear be put to death. He becomes anxiously decisive as he prepares for the battle. Macbeth's rambling about finding cures for Lady Macbeth's disease is ironic. There is no cure because there is no disease. The Macbeths brought this guilt, this unraveling of their lives upon themselves. There is no medicine that either of them can take to get rid of their illness, their problem, their guilt. As usual, you are expected to add to your notes on these themes. Your assessment on Macbeth will take the format of an essay on these themes. Let's move on now to the fourth scene. Turn to page 146 in your textbook. In this short scene, we finally see that the witch's prophecy will not ensure Macbeth's safety. Malcolm instructs his soldiers to chop down branches as a way to camouflage their numbers. At last, the audience is in on the secret. A forest will move to Dunsinane. It's not magic. It's an entirely logical, practical, and clever strategy. On the next slide, you'll hear Mark Birch's analysis of this scene.
Hi, this is Mark Birch, and this is a quick revision of Macbeth Act 5, Scene 4. Once again, we have the theme of concealment and deceit, because the idea of chopping down the wood from Burnham is used by Malcolm to disguise the number within the army. He says, hew down a bough and bear it before him, thereby shall we shadow the numbers of our host, and make discovery error in report of us. In other words, we will deceive the occupants of the castle. They won't be able to see how many of us there are, because they'll just see the boughs of the tree. This is obviously fulfilling the third apparition's prophecy. Burnham Wood is going to come to Dunsinane. And that might seem like a rather contrived narrative twist, but depending on how it's performed on stage, it can be really compelling. What you don't want to have is a couple of blokes turning up with a couple of twigs waved before them. We've now heard Macbeth being described as a tyrant a number of times, but it's interesting that that noun is modified by the adjective confident here. The confident tyrant really draws attention to the fact that it's Macbeth's hubris that's developed by the witches, that's being recognised as his defining characteristic and ultimately the root of his downfall. Seward has already explained that Macbeth is going to have to endure a siege, and Malcolm echoes this, saying it's his main hope, for where there is advantage to be given, both more and less have given him the revolt, and none serve him but constrained things whose hearts are absent too. In other words, whenever there's been an opportunity, people have left him. Thanes have left the castle, and we saw that earlier when he said in Act 5, Scene 3, "Fly false Thanes." But also Malcolm here is repeating the sentiments of Angus in Act 5, Scene 2. Those he commands move only in command, nothing in love. Okay, so.
There are just 4 questions for you to answer. Please pause the video and write your answers in your notebooks. Our second scene for today is Act 5, Scene 5. Starting on page 148 in your textbook. In this scene, Macbeth gets 2 important pieces of news. Firstly, that his wife is dead, and secondly, that Burnham Wood has been seen marching to Dunsinane. Macbeth responds with one of the most famous soliloquies written by Shakespeare. He is resigned to his fate, but he will not quit. On the next slide is a video clip in which Mark Birch analyzes this scene. Take careful notes.
Hi, this is Mark Birch with a quick revision of Macbeth Act 5, Scene 5. Just as we saw in Act 5, Scene 4, Macbeth's excessive confidence is evident. Here it's evident in the personification of his castle as laughing at and scorning a siege. What we've got is an inversion of the natural order, because a siege is generally designed in order to starve out the occupants of a castle, and yet here Macbeth's claiming that the besiegers will starve rather than the occupants of the castle. This inversion of the natural order is madness, but it's something that we've seen right from early on in the play in terms of the disturbance of the great chain of being. Macbeth has disturbed the natural order and inverted that natural order by killing a king. Having been interrupted by the cries of women, Macbeth says, "I've almost forgot the taste of fears." Essentially, he's become desensitised to both fear and horror because of his exposure to them, and because the witches have given him information that's led to him rejecting fear. He's felt invulnerable. He states that it used to be the case that when he heard something terrible, my fell of hair would at a dismal treatise rouse and stir as life were in it. And this is something we know to be the case because in Act 1, Scene 3, when contemplating the murder of Duncan, he referenced the fact that the horrid image doth unfix my hair, in other words, make his hair stand on end. But this has now gone. Macbeth has changed enormously. He's gone from someone who could be disturbed and terrified by the very idea of committing murder to someone who isn't really moved at all by hearing screams. It's worth noting that those screams presumably stem from those who have witnessed the death of Lady Macbeth, and therefore Shakespeare's chosen for that death to take place off stage, maintaining that dramatic focus on Macbeth and his tragic downfall, rather than affording a focus on Lady Macbeth, who's really inconsequential by this point in the play. It's possible to read Macbeth's response to the news of his wife's death in a couple of different ways, and therefore it can be represented dramatically very differently. When he says she should have died hereafter, it's very ambiguous. It could mean that she should have died later, for example when she was old, or after the battle when there would have been an opportunity to mourn. And if you take that reading, it presents Macbeth as quite compassionate. We maybe feel a degree of pity for Macbeth as he approaches his tragic fall. But also, it could mean that she would have died at some point. She should have died hereafter. And that would be quite dispassionate, that Macbeth is unfeeling, that he's fatalistic, that this is just something that's going to happen. And similarly, there would have been a time for such a word. There would be an appropriate time for a word such as dead, whether that's after the battle or when she's much older, etc. Again, depending on the reading. The lines tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to day seems incredibly laboured and ponderous, and that's as a result of the effect of a variety of different devices. You've got the polysyndete on there that creates a sense of endlessness, tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow. You've got the alliteration of day to day, you've got the plosives, petty, pace, creeps, and also the additional beat within the line tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow. It goes on longer than iambic pentameter normally would. So all of this contributes to this sense of something being slow and laboured. The personification of time's passage as well through the verb creeps complements that sense of a slow movement. In other words, life is passing slowly. There's a mundanity to life. The lines that follow, "And all our yesterdays have lighted fools the way to dusty death," suggest that Macbeth feels that despite the slow and lengthy passage of time, this has done nothing to illuminate our lives, nothing to give us any kind of insights, but merely shown the way to death. And that pessimism indicates the pathos of Macbeth. Death doesn't provide a release from the monotony of life, but it's merely a return to dust. The alliteration of harsh d sounds complements the finality and serves to generate a really depressing tone. And it's no wonder that it's so depressing, because remember, Macbeth has damned himself through committing regicide. He's condemned to eternal torment. Death isn't going to be a release, it's going to be a punishment. The candle metaphor could represent life itself or Lady Macbeth. And one of the ways in which it could represent Lady Macbeth is that we have this kind of chromomorphic reference to his wife that we recognise because Lady Macbeth has been associated with a candle before. In Act 5, Scene 1, she has a light by her continually. And we also have that repetition of out, out, creating an allusion to Lady Macbeth's out damned spot, out, I say, from that same scene. The basic idea is that, like a candle, time's short. Life is short. Lady Macbeth's life was short, but life in general is also brief in contrast to the eternity of tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow. We have this sense that there's a tragic significance because Macbeth's damned himself for eternity by the acts he's committed, but he now recognised that not only is his life empty and eternal damnation is on the horizon, but life is short. The brief moment that he has to enjoy the fruits of what he's earned is so limited. This theme of the brevity and pointlessness of life is extended in the following metaphor of a poor actor. A walking shadow could be a reference to an actor itself, as in Puck's concluding speech in A Midsummer Night's Dream, where he states, "If we shadows have offended," or it could just be a metaphor for something insubstantial. But the reference to the poor player or bad actor conveys the idea of a life being briefly full of bluster, but then being over, and the individual being forgotten by history. And this is obviously something that's plaguing the mind of Macbeth, that he has this powerful position, a significant role potentially, but it's so brief and so meaningless in the scope of history. The figurative language use then moves on to life as a play or a speech rather than the actor that's delivering it. The tale is meaningless despite its bluster, as is life. A tale told by an idiot full of sound and fury, in other words, lots of noise, lots of bluster, but signifying nothing, being empty, being meaningless. Having been told that Birnam Wood is advancing towards Dunsinane, Macbeth says, "I pull in resolution and begin to doubt the equivocation of the fiend that lies like truth." Now, pull here may be an incorrect transcription, with Paul perhaps being more appropriate, as in, I pull in resolution, I'm losing my resolution, I'm paling, I'm being shrouded. But similarly, pull works in terms of, pulling back from resolution, losing faith. So either interpretation is fine in terms of conveying the idea that Macbeth is losing his resolve and overconfidence as he recognises that he's been manipulated by the supernatural, that the witches have equivocated with language, that they've manipulated it and him through what they've told him. And this is kind of the resolution of lots of equivocation that we've had throughout the play, perhaps writ most large when the porter explored this notion in Act 2, Scene 3. But the idea was articulated way back in Act 1, Scene 3 by Banquo, when he said, "And oftentimes to win us to our harm, the instruments of darkness tell us truths, win us with honest trifles to betray us in deepest consequence." We need to remember that Macbeth began this scene with profound confidence. He was going to survive a siege and starve out the enemy. But now, when he states, "Arm, arm and out, there is nor flying hence nor tarrying here," he's casting aside that sensible course of action and deciding to ride out of the castle. Exactly what the Scottish lords and the English lords who were facing him said that he couldn't possibly do because that would be madness. Macbeth's rushing towards his fate, and the confidence has been lost as he recognises the equivocation of the witches. And the scene ends quite nihilistically with this imagery of giving in to fate. Macbeth states, "I begin to be aweary of the sun and wish the estate of the world were now undone." So he's sick of the light, he's sick of life, he wishes for the world to be torn apart. And we can hear some of this fatalism through the use of such profound rhyming couplets. "I begin to be aweary of the sun and wish the estate of the world were now undone. Ring the alarm bell, blow wind, come rack, at least we'll die with harness on our back." So you've got a double rhyming couplet to end this scene, really reinforcing this sense of finality. It's not just the end of the scene, it's really the end of Macbeth. Okay, ta.
Here are the remaining 4 questions for today. Please pause the video and write your answers in your notebooks. Macbeth's soliloquy in scene 5 is very important. Memorize these quotes from that speech. Now you will see the connection between the Robert Frost poem that we studied and this play. Please revisit this poem in order to understand this allusion. There is another work of literature that takes its title from Act 5, Scene 5, William Faulkner's The Sound and the Fury. This Nobel Prize-winning author tells the story of the Compson family who lose their wealth, their religious faith, and the respect of the people in their town. Many of the characters die tragic deaths. I challenge you to read this novel as one of your 7 novels for the Grade 12 IEB oral examination. We're almost finished with the play Grade 10s. Just one more lesson to go. Until then, be good.